My brother snapped, "You're just a failure." I smiled and said, "Then why did your boss hire me as his partner?" The room froze as I leaned in and whispered, "Tomorrow, you'll find out if you still have a job." I, 32 had spent the better part of my 20s being the family disappointment. My brother was the golden child, the one who graduated top of his class, landed a prestigious job at a major consulting firm, bought a house before 30, and never missed an opportunity to remind me of my failures. I had dropped out of business school, bounced between startups, lived in a cramped apartment, and drove a car that sounded like it was dying every time I turned the ignition. Family dinners were torture. Every gathering turned into a highlight reel of my brother's accomplishments while I sat there, nodding politely, pretending the constant jabs didn't cut deep. Mom would try to deflect, asking me about my work, but even her questions felt like pity. Dad had essentially given up on me after I dropped out, rarely making eye contact anymore. What they didn't know was that for the past 18 months, I had been working on something. One of those failed startups had taught me more about business operations and efficiency consulting than any degree ever could. I had been quietly building a reputation in niche circles, taking on small clients, fixing their broken systems, and watching my network grow. I kept my mouth shut at family events because I knew the moment I mentioned any success, my brother would find a way to diminish it. 3 months ago, everything changed. I received a call from someone who had heard about my work through a mutual contact. He ran a private equity firm and was looking for someone to help optimize operations across his portfolio companies. We met for coffee, then dinner, then several long strategy sessions. He saw something in my approach that resonated with him, and before I knew it, he was offering me a partnership stake in a new venture he was launching. The deal was structured carefully. I would come in as a silent partner initially, learning the ropes of his existing operations while we prepared to launch the new division. The firm he ran had several major clients, and I spent weeks in meetings, learning the landscape, understanding the players. One name kept coming up in our discussions about organizational restructuring and efficiency improvements. My brother's company. His firm had been struggling with project delivery timelines and client satisfaction scores. They were bleeding money on inefficiencies, and the leadership knew they needed outside help. They had already engaged my new partner's firm for a comprehensive operational audit and restructuring plan. My partner asked if I wanted to lead the engagement. I looked at the client name on the folder and felt something twist in my chest. This was it. I told him I was interested but wanted to stay in the background for the initial assessment phase. He agreed, and I spent the next 6 weeks buried in data about my brother's company, identifying every bottleneck, every inefficiency, every management blind spot. I built a presentation that would gut their current structure and rebuild it from the ground up. It was thorough, it was brutal, and it was exactly what they needed. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Mom's birthday dinner was scheduled for Saturday night, and my presentation to the executive board was set for the following Monday morning. I knew my brother would be there, in that conference room, sitting across from me when I walked in as the lead partner on the engagement. Saturday arrived, and I drove to my parents' house with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I had prepared for this moment, rehearsed every possible response, every potential outcome. My brother's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, that sleek luxury sedan he loved to show off. I parked my beat-up vehicle next to it and walked inside. The evening started predictably. Mom hugged me, told me I looked thin, asked if I was eating properly. Dad shook my hand with that distant grip he'd perfected over the years. My brother was in the kitchen, drink in hand, already holding court with our uncle about some major deal his team had just closed. Dinner conversation flowed around me. My brother talked about his promotion potential, about the new projects his department was taking on, about his boss's confidence in his leadership abilities. I ate quietly, responding when spoken to, watching the dynamic play out like I had dozens of times before. Then my brother turned to me, that familiar smirk on his face. He asked what I'd been up to lately, whether I was still jumping between those little projects that never went anywhere. I told him I'd been consulting, keeping busy. He laughed, said that was a nice way of saying I was still figuring things out. Mom tried to redirect the conversation, but my brother was on a roll. He started talking about stability, about the importance of building a real career, about how opportunities don't wait forever. Every word was aimed at me, every sentence designed to reinforce the narrative that had been built over years. I let him talk. I let him build up steam, let him enjoy the moment. Then he said it, the line that gave me the perfect opening. He told me I needed to face reality, that I was just a failure who couldn't commit to anything long enough to make it work. The room went quiet. Mom looked horrified. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My uncle stared at his plate, and I just smiled. I asked my brother a simple question. If I was such a failure, why had his boss hired me as his partner? I said it calmly, clearly, watching his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then something close to panic. He demanded to know what I was talking about. I explained that I had been working with the private equity firm his company had engaged for their operational restructuring. I mentioned that I'd been leading the assessment for the past 6 weeks, and that I'd be presenting our findings and recommendations to the executive board on Monday morning. The color drained from his face. He tried to laugh it off, said I must be mistaken, that I couldn't possibly be involved in something at that level. I pulled out my phone, opened my email, and showed him the calendar invitation for Monday's board meeting. My name was listed as the lead presenter. I stood up, walked around the table, and leaned close to him. I told him that tomorrow he'd find out whether he still had a job. Then I straightened up, thanked Mom for dinner, and walked out. Update 1. I didn't sleep much that night. Part of me felt guilty for dropping that bomb at Mom's birthday dinner, but a larger part felt a satisfaction I couldn't quite suppress. Years of being dismissed, of being treated like the family embarrassment, and I'd finally had my moment. Sunday was spent doing final prep work for the presentation. My partner called me in the afternoon, asking if I'd heard anything unusual from the client. Apparently, one of the board members had received a frantic call from my brother, trying to get information about the consulting team and raising concerns about conflicts of interest. My partner was annoyed, but not surprised. He asked me directly if there was something I needed to tell him about my relationship with anyone at the client company. I explained the situation, told him about my brother, about the dinner, about everything. I expected him to be angry, but instead, he just laughed. He told me that my brother's call had actually backfired. The board member he'd contacted was the CEO, the same person who had specifically requested an unflinching assessment of the organization, no matter whose feelings got hurt. The CEO had called my partner after speaking with my brother, asking whether the lead consultant had any reason to soften the findings due to personal connections. My partner had assured him that I was professional above all else, and that the assessment would stand on its merits. The CEO seemed satisfied and mentioned he was looking forward to Monday's presentation even more now. I spent Sunday evening going through the presentation one more time. The recommendations were harsh, but necessary. My brother's department was one of the main problem areas, suffering from poor project management, unclear accountability structures, and leadership that prioritized appearance over results. The data was irrefutable. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. I dressed in my best suit, the one I'd bought specifically for this engagement, and drove to the client's office building downtown. My partner met me in the lobby, and we rode the elevator up together in silence. The conference room was already full when we walked in. The entire executive team was there, including the CEO, CFO, COO, and several department heads. My brother was sitting near the end of the table, his face carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. The CEO welcomed us, made introductions, and invited us to begin. I connected my laptop to the projector and launched into the presentation. I had structured it carefully, starting with high-level findings before drilling into specific departments and issues. For the first 20 minutes, I kept things general, talking about overall organizational structure, communication breakdowns, and systemic inefficiencies. The executives took notes, asked clarifying questions, and seemed genuinely engaged with the material. Then I got to the department-level analysis. I pulled up the data on project delivery timelines, client satisfaction scores, and internal efficiency metrics. My brother's department was performing in the bottom quartile across almost every measure. I didn't single him out by name, but everyone in the room could see which division I was discussing. I presented the root cause analysis, breaking down how poor project scoping, inadequate resource allocation, and weak accountability structures were creating cascading problems throughout the organization. I showed them how much money they were losing, how many clients they were disappointing, and how the issues were getting worse over time. One of the board members asked about leadership responsibility. I explained that middle management in that division seemed more focused on managing up than managing effectively, creating a culture where problems were hidden rather than solved. The projects looked good on paper, but the actual execution was consistently behind schedule and over budget. My brother tried to interject, started making excuses about resource constraints and competing priorities. The CEO cut him off, asked him to hold questions until the end of the presentation. I watched my brother sink back into his chair, his face flushed. I continued through the rest of the assessment, covering other departments and issues, but the damage to my brother's position was already done. When I reached the recommendations section, I laid out a comprehensive restructuring plan. For my brother's department, I recommended bringing in external project management expertise, implementing strict accountability metrics, and conducting a thorough review of all leadership positions to ensure the right people were in the right roles. The presentation ended, and the room sat in silence for a moment. Then the questions started. The executives drilled into specific findings, asked about implementation timelines, challenged certain assumptions. I answered everything methodically, backing up every claim with data. My brother sat quietly through most of it, only speaking when directly asked about his department's performance. His explanations sounded weak in the face of the evidence I presented, full of justifications that didn't address the underlying problems. After 2 hours, the CEO thanked us for the thorough assessment and said the executive team would need time to discuss the findings and recommendations. My partner and I packed up our materials and left. In the elevator down, my partner told me I'd done excellent work. He mentioned that he'd already received a text from the CEO expressing appreciation for the brutal honesty and saying they'd be moving forward with most of our recommendations. I drove home feeling numb. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel was mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite identify. I'd proven my worth, demonstrated my competence, but the look on my brother's face in that conference room kept replaying in my mind. Update 2. The fallout started almost immediately. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom asking what had happened, saying my brother had come home upset and refused to talk about the meeting. Dad called later that evening, his voice tight with anger, demanding to know if I'd deliberately sabotaged my brother's career. I tried to explain that I'd simply done my job, that the assessment was based on objective data, that my brother's performance issues were real and documented. Dad didn't want to hear it. He told me I'd betrayed my family, that I'd let jealousy and resentment turn me into someone he didn't recognize. I hung up feeling worse than I had in years. The professional victory felt hollow when weighed against the family cost. Tuesday morning, my partner called with an update. The client wanted to move forward with the restructuring immediately and had asked our firm to help manage the implementation. They were making significant leadership changes, including in my brother's department. His position wasn't being eliminated, but he was being moved to a project management role with no direct reports, effectively a demotion. I asked if I needed to be involved in the implementation phase. My partner said it was up to me, but the CEO had specifically requested that I stay on to ensure consistency. The professional opportunity was clear, but so was the personal complication. I spent the next few days avoiding my family's calls and messages. My brother sent me a long text calling me vindictive and pathetic, accusing me of hiding behind professional credibility to settle personal scores. He claimed I'd twisted the data, exaggerated problems, and deliberately made him look bad. I didn't respond. What could I say? That the data spoke for itself? That his poor performance had nothing to do with me? None of it would matter to him. Thursday afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my uncle, the one who'd been at the birthday dinner. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, curious about what he wanted. We met at a quiet cafe near my apartment. He ordered for both of us and then got straight to the point. He told me he'd spoken with my brother, heard his version of events, but also knew enough about business to understand that consulting firms don't base major recommendations on family grudges. He asked me to walk him through what had actually happened from the beginning. I did, explaining how I'd built my consulting practice, how I'd met my partner, how the engagement with my brother's company had come about. I showed him some of the anonymized data I was allowed to share, explained the methodology behind the assessment. My uncle listened carefully, asking occasional questions. When I finished, he sat back and sighed. He told me that my brother had always been given everything easily, that the family's constant praise had created blind spots in his self-awareness. He said my brother probably genuinely believed he was performing well because no one had ever given him honest feedback before. Then my uncle asked me the question I'd been avoiding. Had I enjoyed it? Had I taken satisfaction in exposing my brother's failures in front of his bosses? I thought about it for a long time before answering. I admitted that yes, part of me had enjoyed having the upper hand for once, had enjoyed proving that I wasn't the failure they'd all assumed I was. But I also told him that the satisfaction had faded quickly, replaced by a complicated mix of guilt and vindication that I was still trying to process. My uncle nodded, said that was an honest answer. He told me that my brother needed this wake-up call, that maybe it would force him to develop some self-awareness and humility. But he also warned me that family relationships, once broken, are hard to repair. I told him I understood and that I'd tried to avoid this situation, had kept my professional success quiet specifically to prevent this kind of conflict. It was my brother who'd pushed, who'd insisted on making me feel small at every opportunity. My uncle agreed but pointed out that my response, while professionally justified, had been personally devastating. He suggested I think carefully about what kind of relationship I wanted with my family going forward and whether this victory was worth the cost. Update 3. 2 weeks passed. The restructuring at my brother's company moved forward. I stayed on the implementation team, working with their new leadership to build better systems and processes. My brother and I didn't cross paths during any of it. He'd been moved to a different floor, assigned to projects that didn't intersect with the areas I was working on. Mom called eventually. She didn't yell or accuse. She just sounded tired. She asked if I was happy now, whether proving I was smarter than my brother had been worth tearing the family apart. I told her I hadn't set out to tear anything apart, that I'd simply done my job well. She said she knew that, but she also knew I could have declined the engagement, could have asked my partner to assign someone else once I realized my brother's company was the client. She was right, of course. I could have stepped back. I'd made a choice to move forward, and that choice had consequences beyond the professional realm. The conversation ended with Mom asking me to come to dinner the following Sunday. She said we needed to talk as a family, to figure out how to move forward. I agreed, though I wasn't optimistic about how it would go. Sunday dinner was awkward in ways that made the birthday dinner look comfortable. My brother barely acknowledged my presence. Dad was coldly polite. Only Mom tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Halfway through the meal, my brother finally spoke to me directly. He asked if I was satisfied, whether humiliating him in front of his colleagues had lived up to my expectations. I told him I hadn't humiliated him, that his own work performance had done that long before I showed up. The argument that followed was brutal. Years of resentment poured out from both sides. He accused me of being jealous, vindictive, and petty. I threw back every dismissive comment, every casual insult, every time he'd made me feel worthless at family gatherings. Mom started crying. Dad stood up and left the room. My uncle, who'd been invited as a mediator of sorts, just watched silently. When we'd both exhausted our anger, the room fell quiet. My brother asked me a simple question. He wanted to know if I actually hated him or if this had just been about proving a point. I told him I didn't hate him. I told him I resented being treated like a failure when I'd been working hard to build something meaningful. I resented that my successes were dismissed while his were celebrated, that nothing I did was ever good enough to earn respect from my own family. He was quiet for a long time. Then he admitted that the demotion had forced him to look at things he'd been avoiding. His boss had been blunt in the feedback session, telling him that his lack of self-awareness and accountability had been holding back the entire department. The restructuring had revealed problems he hadn't wanted to see. He said he still thought I'd handled the situation poorly, that I'd let personal feelings influence professional decisions. But he also acknowledged that the assessment itself had been accurate and that he needed to do better. It wasn't reconciliation, not really, but it was the first honest conversation we'd had in years. Dad came back into the room eventually. He sat down heavily and looked at both of us. He said he'd failed as a father, that he'd created competition between us instead of supporting us both. He apologized for dismissing my path, for assuming that because it looked different from my brother's, it was less valuable. Mom reached across the table and took both our hands. She said she just wanted her sons to respect each other, that she was tired of choosing sides and managing conflicts. The dinner ended without resolution, but with a fragile understanding. My brother and I weren't friends, probably wouldn't be for a long time if ever. But we'd established boundaries, aired grievances, and maybe created space for something healthier to develop. 3 months have passed since then. I'm still working on the implementation project at my brother's company, though we've developed an unspoken agreement to maintain professional distance. My business partnership is thriving, and I've taken on several other high-profile engagements. Family dinners are still uncomfortable, but the open hostility has faded into cautious politeness. My brother has apparently taken the feedback seriously and is working with a professional coach to improve his leadership skills. Dad makes an effort to ask about my work in ways that don't sound like pity. I still don't know if I made the right choice. The professional success is real, the financial security is growing, and I've proven to myself and others that I'm not the failure I was labeled as for so many years. But the family cost was high, and I'm not sure the scales balance out. Sometimes late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd just stayed quiet at that birthday dinner, if I'd let my brother's insult slide like I had so many times before. Maybe the family would still be intact. Maybe I'd still be the disappointment, but at least everyone would be speaking to each other. But then I remember the look on my brother's face when I revealed my role in his company's restructuring. I remember the shift in power, the sudden understanding that I wasn't someone to be dismissed anymore. And I remember that respect, once lost, is nearly impossible to reclaim through submission. I don't regret standing up for myself. I regret that standing up required tearing someone else down, even if that person had been tearing me down for years. I regret that family dynamics made it impossible for both of us to succeed without one of us failing. Mostly, I regret that it came to this at all, that years of small cruelties and dismissive comments built up into something that could only be resolved through professional destruction and family rupture. The title of failure doesn't sting anymore. I've proven it wrong in every measurable way. But the cost of that proof sits with me every day, a weight that success alone can't lift.